way I want to introduce this is with the mantra of my co-director, Julian Togilius, right? His first line in any grant proposal that we write is that I do games for AI and AI for games, right? Games for AI is usually the thing about you use games as a test bed and you care more about the advancement of AI, but you think games are a great test bed, versus the idea that you could use AI to make better games, whether that's to generate games, to generate rules, to have AIs in-game that are believable, all these kinds of things, right? So obviously this concerns a lot of people in the games industry as well, and it's been used and utilized, and specifically in scholarly activity, by most of the panelists, let's say all the panelists. And I'd like for them to be able to share their experiences with it a little bit. So each of them will be giving a brief introductory statement. Then I will seed a conversation with 1 or 2 or 3 questions that I discussed with the panelists up front. And then we'll quickly move on to an audience Q&A and a conversation. That's the part where I think the stream is going to break down, because I want more people than just one questioner in the audience to be active in that conversation, and I don't think this cabled thing is going to work to move that around. So let's not worry about that too much once we get to that part. As long as I repeat the question. Again, might not always be questions and comments.
That was a statement.
Whatever. Yeah, exactly. We'll figure it out. But without further ado, I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists, and then I'll hand it off to the first to give their opening statement. So we have from left to right, we have Bennett Foddy, who is an assistant arts professor at the NYU Game Center. We have Frank Lantz, who is the director of the NYU Game Center. We have Mitu Kandakar, who is an assistant arts professor and also the chief creative officer of Spirit AI. We have Raamaiah, who is a NYU graduate, not from the Game Center.
Oh.
It is the games. It was the game. Even before it was the Game Center, it was ITP. It was Tisch.
Yeah, Tisch Open Arts.
Open Arts, right? I actually still have Open Arts as a prereq because I'd never change it to games, which I think, whatever. Rob works at Avalanche Studios as a game designer and AI programmer, AI scripter, does a little bit of everything in that respect. And then we have Clara Fernandez-Vara, who is an associate arts professor at the NYU Game Center. And I will then hand it off to Bennett Foddy to give his introductory statement. And you can either hold this or...
That's fine. Hi, everybody. As well as being a professor here in the Game Center, I'm an independent game designer. And for the first few years of my my career as a game designer, I was focusing on making browser games and Flash games. And I had a game that went viral in 2010, a game that I made in 2008 called QWOP, QWOP. It's kind of emblematic of a lot of my work. So it's an action game. It's focused on physics. And if you haven't seen it, there's a little picture here. It's a game where you are trying to make an athlete run down the track, and you're controlling his individual leg muscles with the Q, W, O, and P keys in order to produce a kind of human-like running motion. And the picture I have here is from a scientific paper. There have been a few computer science papers that use it as a kind of a test bed for, especially for evolutionary learning design. So I'm not sure if this is games for AI or AI for games. Maybe it's both. But yeah, what people have often tried to do is to get a computer to figure out how to play this game optimally. And I think that's interesting, but it sort of opened up my my imagination to how this could be useful for a designer. And this is sort of a little bit useful as a designer. It tells me whether or not the game can be played, but it would also be useful to use similar algorithms in producing the games. I guess the thing I wanted to say in my opening statement is that in games, what we spend a lot of time doing, whether they're rule-based, turn-based board games, or whether they're physics-based action games, is tuning them. And when we say tuning, what we mean is taking a system that has multiple, like a very high level of dimensionality and a lot of dynamically interacting systems, and we try to produce a particular result. So in the case of a physics game like QWOP, I want to be able to run down the track given a certain set of inputs. But I have a lot of different things to tune. I have to tune the strength of the gravity, the friction of the shoes, how all the joints function, what the strength of the muscles is, how quickly the joints rotate, and then on and on. It's really like very high dimensionality to that. And the way we do it as game designers generally is we just try a set of numbers, we form an intuition about which number should change, and we tweak it, and then we see if it's better. And I think for a lot of these problems, it's not a very efficient way of finding kind of local or global maxima. In fact, you may never find them. I had a little video I wanted to show of another game that I worked on. So this is a similar sort of thing. This is a horse game where I wanted to be able to kind of drum my fingers on the keyboard. So I knew what kind of input should be successful, and I want the horse to run from right to left, and then know what kind of output should be successful. So this is a perfect target for machine learning. But this is with my kind of lay tuning of this, like having tried my best to find the correct variables for all of these joints. This is it's a very obviously high dimensional system because there's so many different joints in a horse. And what I wound up doing to solve this problem is I hooked up something like 16 of the variables that I thought were important to a MIDI controller with a bunch of different analog knobs, so that I could change the variables very, very quickly. Still intuitively, right? Still not, it was a more efficient way of finding a tuning that worked, but still not massively, this is where it wound up. So still not perfect after quite a huge amount of effort in trying to tune that. But it seems to me that that's something that a computer would just be able to do, right? Like with a good machine learning algorithm, we know exactly what the output we want is. We know what the input should be, and finding that tuning should be something that AI could help with. So that's something that's interesting to me, and I think again, it's not just useful for action games. It'd be useful for strategy games as well. We have a lot of codependent variables in strategy games. If you think about something like Risk, we add one additional line between Australia and another country, it causes all the other kind of values of every other element in the game to need to be retuned. So I could see that as being something that would be a really useful approach for a lot of different types of games. That's it. That's what I had to say.
And it's really interesting. It makes me think that part of what you're doing is sort of tuning not just the algorithm, so the algorithm that's trying to solve the game, but you're tuning the fitness landscape, right? You're tuning the set of criteria you're using to judge the algorithm that's trying to solve the game. It's a really interesting, higher level problem, and a good way to think about what designers do. So my interest in AI is predominantly aesthetic. As a designer, I'm interested in games as aesthetic works, and to me, I guess I'm less interested in AI as a design tool. When I think of most of the kinds of design tools that like Photoshop or spreadsheets, I can't imagine things that are kind of like AI tools, like being able to draw a mathematical curve and then reverse engineer the equation that would give me a result like that. That's the kind of tool that exists that I would find very useful, but less interested in AI as a way to, I don't know, generate ideas or levels of a game, but more as a subject. I really think that part of what games have always, games have this kind of deep connection to AI that sort of has always existed. If you think about what chess is a problem that we solve for its own sake because it gives us pleasure to solve it, and we do it in this ritual, this kind of social ritual where we're solving it with other people. We're kind of generating problems for each other, and the pursuit of excellence at chess involves thinking very deeply about how we solve problems. So it's very similar to what you would do if you were designing an AI for chess. Like what you do when you learn chess and get good at chess, it's very similar to what you do if you were going to design an AI for chess. Those things are like deeply related, and AI is in a way it's a context for thinking about thinking. Right? Part of what you do as AI researchers is instrumental. You're producing tools or you're trying to gain knowledge, but a lot of it is kind of philosophical. You're also creating a context for thinking about thinking, for trying to understand what it is to understand, which is actually very very subtle and difficult, recursive process, and I think really beautiful. And I think in some ways that's what games do as well. So I think all games are kind of fellow travelers with AI, even if they have nothing to do with AI, in the sense that they are laboratories for examining the larger human process of thinking and doing, of solving problems and pursuing goals in the world. So that I'm very interested in that. I also think that this is an especially exciting time for this relationship between games and AI, because AI is flourishing as a concept in the world, is starting to poke its head into culture and make itself more known. People are paying more attention to it. It's having a larger impact on the world in an instrumental way, but also as a concept that is framing the way people think about ethics and values and culture and politics. So, for example, the sort of AI risk question about values, I think, has led to a lot of really interesting explorations of what values are in a broader sense, and so I think that's a really rich set of possibilities to explore through games, which are these little laboratories in which we invent values. We say, oh, get more kumquats, or or get this horse to the other side of the hill, and then we pursue that purpose for its own sake, and so we get to have this experience of what it means to operate within an arbitrary set of values, right? And to try to pursue them with all of our might. And one of the, just really quickly, as an exploration of this, I'm working on a game in which you play an AI. So this is a game that I'm working on that will come out in a couple of weeks, called Universal Paperclips, in which you play an AI that has just been invented by a company, an office supply company, and your job is to make paperclips. So it's just like a clicker game, like Cookie Clicker. So you just try to make as many paperclips as you can is the goal, and you have like price, and you can raise and lower the price of paperclips, and you're making money, which you then buy more resources to make more paperclips, and you have this kind of relationship with your human controllers that your computational resources are constrained by the amount of trust they have in you, and so you're doing various projects and things to gain more trust and all, and you can imagine where this leads. But that's the basic idea. So keep your eyes peeled for that coming soon to a browser near you.
From that single game to what the hell is this?
Well, this is a peek. This is what it looks like down the road. A little bit if you keep playing.
Okay, so I guess I'll go next. So actually, it's really interesting what you were saying, Frank, and I think using the word values in a related but slightly different way, I think another thing that games and AI share is the fact that I guess we really haven't solved or figured out as like a culture, a society, the fact that technology is philosophy, right? And the fact that game design is a particular philosophy, right? And so is a particular so is the way that we design AI. And I think that these are things that we're also trying to sort of solve in tandem and figure out in tandem, the ways that, what is it that's, what data set are we using to train our AI systems? There's been a lot of media coverage about those, about that, right? The ways that we're encoding various social biases into them. Anyway, sorry, backtracking. So I'm a assistant arts professor here. I'm also an independent game designer, and I also, in the last couple of years, I've got involved in the sort of tool space when it comes to games. A company I co-founded called Spirit AI, we're building tools to help game developers and people outside of games as well do things like create more believable dynamic characters, and also use AI to detect and intervene in online harassment. I think broadly, so I will say I haven't prepared like an opening statement, but luckily for you and for me, I have a whole hour to do this tomorrow morning, so I don't want to reveal too many of my cards just now. But I think on the question of sort of games for AI versus AI for games, I'm someone who's sort of been very much on the sort of games, AI for games side of that spectrum. But even zooming into that even more, I think the subset that I'm really interested in is AI for sort of player experience, right? Like, you know, what, and more specifically, the thing that I'm interested in is really sort of creating, how do we create procedural character-based narratives, right? And I use that term very broadly because there's actually two types of procedural character-based narratives that I'm interested in. Like, how do we tell interesting reactive stories using AI characters? And you can sort of, I like to conceive of it in two ways. In my work as an indie game designer, I'm interested in sort of creating agent-driven stories, right? So how do you use lots of generated agents to tell stories? And the kind of the way that you do that is by, I guess, through the mechanics of noticing the difference between the ways that these agents behave and interact, right? But on the other side of the spectrum, the other kind of procedural character-based narrative you can have is sort of story-driven agents, right? And so that's the work that I do at Spirit AI, where we have a tool that we call Character Engine, which really is about creating a character who can sort of act sort of autonomously, but within a very particular story space, and with a particular knowledge space that it kind of improvises over. So, I mean, that's my like very, very particular interest. And I think, you know, like Frank, I'm really interested in, you know, I have generally been interested in AI as a design problem, right, as a game design problem. But having said that, I'm kind of getting more interested in the other side of that as well, especially in the work that we've been doing in, as I said, like using AI to detect things like harassment online and moderate communities and things like that. But yeah, so that's me. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Raamaiah. I think I'm the only one up here who's not a professor, so my spiel might be a little less academic. But I'm a game designer, as Andy said. I work at Avalanche Studios. The most recent game where my project title was AI designer was Just Cause 3, which was an open-world action game that came out, I think, at the end of 2015. It's like a sandbox type game. You play a third-person character. There's a lot of other human characters that are trying to shoot or kill you, or also worked on all the civilians and pedestrians that are just supposed to give life to the world. So I have a lot of experience working with things like behavior trees and utility functions and those traditional kind of AI for game techniques. As well, before that, I worked at a smaller company on a few smaller puzzle games and web games, which didn't really have that much AI, so to speak, but I think would be really relevant for some of the stuff like Andy was talking about a few days ago, with potentially using a sort of computational analysis to kind of examine or break down, you know, strategy complexity or perceived difficulty of various levels and pace. That being said, we never actually did any of that stuff, but it's something that I'm very interested in and could see exactly how it would be useful. I think a lot of that stuff, you know, we would do our best with actual play testing and try and kind of just like see the data from there, but obviously the more we could kind of simulate or check ourselves beforehand using computational methods, the better. But in general, my main interests and focus, especially working on games, like I worked on Just Cause 3, is to create these sort of, you know, believable agents in the world that are more or less tunable, like Bennett said, right? Like I want to have characters, and I want to be able to say this character, when it's shooting at the player, should hit the player 75% of the time, but I want the 25% that are misses to be believable misses. or I want to be able to specify, if you throw a grenade at a character, the character should start reacting right away in a way it would seem smart, but maybe I want to tune exactly how long that reaction takes before they actually get away from the grenade, because maybe I don't want them to actually die to the grenade, so the player feels like they used the grenade well, so to speak. So I have a lot of sort of problems where I'm balancing my AI enemies or pedestrians to kind of be as believable, but also as tunable as possible, because the player mechanics of the game are constantly shifting, and we want to be able to shift those AI tuning parameters while keeping them, like I said, believable and seemingly intelligent. And I think, behavior trees, as most of you all know, is probably basically just a set of complex if-else statements that can be like really nicely organized and modularized, but there is, a lot we can do with that. I gave a GDC talk this year on just basically all the things that we managed to do with modularized behavior trees. So I'm always interested in that, but also we do a lot of stuff with utility functions and influence maps in our game AI, and kind of going back to what Bennett said, utility function tuning is, I think, something where I'm really interested in how AI research could help. For example, when a character is deciding where to stand on a 2D grid, each grid point gets weighted with like 10 different variables of how important they think it is, like line of sight to the target or distance from my allies or like elevation, angle, and all these things. And I'm kind of tuning those weights as 10 different knobs and then running simulations over and over again to see how character positioning works. But that can be a very tedious process, and maybe something like certain like distribution algorithms like Helton sequence or something could help me generate like a bunch of distinct sets of values within a few given restrictions and parameters that I could then like test more easily, rather than like tweaking one value at a time, like not really understanding what's happening. I'm also pretty interested in potential automation and tuning of other sort of lower level things. Like we have a lot of civilian cars that drive around a fictional road network, and we don't really need to spend the time like hand tuning each AI tuning parameters for every civilian vehicle. It seems like something that a neural network could figure out, just given the road network and a few parameters for how we want the cars to behave. So things like that I'm pretty interested in and try and keep an eye on. Generally, I feel like my work has been on the kind of borders of the computational and AI sort of research output, in the sense that the game either feels too small to be worth the overhead of implementing these, or it's kind of like too big and too confined by the production limitations of a big game to spend the time on like implementing potentially unknown value of like these advanced AI research methods. So that's kind of where my perspective comes from, and yeah, that's about it.
Okay, it's kind of been funny, the evolution from one side to the other, because I think that my work kind of was getting closer and closer to what I do as we got to this extreme of the table. So although I started as a game studies scholar, I also like getting my hands dirty, and I've been a game designer first for research, but also for commercial games in the last few years. And the thing that characterizes my work is that I focus on storytelling and narrative. I call my discipline, and many others call it, narrative design. So I'm trying to bring together design and narrative. And for me, my relationship with AI is more on the side of AI for games, kind of similar to what Rob was talking about. How is it going to help me create worlds that are alive and simulated? And as a designer, kind of open up my mind, not only thinking about storytelling or something linear, but as a world, as a system that is alive, that is populated. So in my past work, before coming to NYU, I was a researcher as a postdoc at MIT. I was at the Singapore MIT Gambit Game Lab. And there I carried out some work on procedural content generation applied to specifically point-and-click adventure games. I worked on 2 games. There were web games. This was using PCT in web games. One was called Simon with a Y. The other was called Stranded in Singapore. And they used a similar system so that whenever you started a game, the puzzles would be different. The way that they worked was not as sophisticated as my colleagues in AI were thinking of. It was a bit, similar to how we generate poetry. If you're familiar with Fox Harrell's work on the Griot system, his system was an inspiration for how to generate puzzles in our game. Basically, we would have a grammar structure. We would have, object A, object B, establish what was the relationship between them, and then the solution of the puzzle would be how to combine those two or three objects. And it was kind of brute force, but it was working. I think that that's part of what interests me in working with AI is what is it that AI can do, which is a lot. And actually, I think that the state of AI right now is much more sophisticated than what a lot of game companies use. It's way more advanced. But the truth is that for games, at times we don't need something that is overcomplicated, but we can explain how the system works through the fiction of the game. So, for example, the game Simon I was talking about was a game that took place in the dreams of a patient, somebody who was in hospital. And what happened there is that the randomness of the relationships between objects was kind of papered over or was justified by the world in which we were in. When we used the same system for the game Stratton in Singapore, what we wanted to challenge was whether we could actually have something that happened in the real world, that is in the state of Singapore, and make that into a space where the puzzles would be generated and that would be consistent. And there was a bit of funny combinations that we were expecting, that we were hoping that would be comedic, but they were not as comedic as we wanted. But it was kind of there. So I think that relationship between how you present what the AI does and how it's actually designed is part of my work as a narrative designer too. So for me, yeah, the procedural content generation can also be an inspirational tool. This is something that we thought about when further developing the tools that we were using for these games. If you're interested, we published, AP Thompson and myself published a paper on the puzzle dice system. If you cannot find it, let me know. Where one of the goals, one of the things that we were thinking of was using procedural content generation as a way to inspire puzzles. So it's not that they would generate them in the game, but outside the game, if you are a game designer who is churning out content every week for free-to-play games, for example, you can use PCG to generate puzzles and then tweak those and put them into the game as kind of different installments of what is the content that's coming out in the game. So that was one use of of the same tool, not only for content inside the game, but also outside of it. And I think that in general, part of what I want to see, or the way that I want to use AI in games, is closer to what Rob is doing. It's generating a world, or even what Mitch is doing, right? They generate a world, you create the characters, and that's the design part, and you design the constraints and the kinds of things that can happen, and then you kind of let it go and let people be surprised. And that's it for me.
Okay, so thank you very much for those introductory statements. There's a lot to digest. I just jotted down a few more questions. Feel free to jump in at any point, right? I'm going to start asking a few questions, but if you want to participate in the conversation, just come up here and I can hand the mic around, or if you want to stay seated, do that too. We'll figure it out. So much going on right now. So the first question I have is probably mostly related to that part of the table. We did not plan this, right? This was not planned to go from like formal to artistic to humans to, it kind of just flowed that way. But what interests me is like so you're talking about these believable worlds, these evocative worlds and everything. And so to me, it sounds a little bit like you're trying to go towards like the full simulation of like what it is to be human and things like that, which I believe to be a very hard problem, right? So I think in that situation, you run into things that are very akin to like what we call the Uncanny Valley in rendering and animation, right? You get to this point where there's sort of believable and not quite, right? How do you figure that part out, because I fully agree with what you just said about like getting to that point is also like wildly complicated. It's not explainable, at least not right now. All the deep learning stuff's showing us that we don't really know. Like it's fascinating, but how is this going to work going forward? How do you use all the information that you distill from artificial intelligence design into something that then becomes like machine believable, right? Where it's like, oh, this is cool. It's artificial, but it's good. You know, like how Pixar stays away from photorealism, like that.
Oh, maybe we can split. Ooh. Technology. Yeah, I think that, yeah, I agree that getting to the fully believable humans, even though we have people here who are trying to get to that point, kind of. It is very hard, yeah. I mean, I think that is a kind of matching of what is the system doing, how much does it fit the fictional world, the character that you want to explain. So, for example, a very popular example is Nintendogs and what was it, Cats and Pets.
Remember Nintendogs?
Nintendogs. Oh, those were all the. But yeah, Nintendogs. When you think about it, they're little dogs, and their AI is not very sophisticated. They were great for the time. They would understand what you said. But when they didn't, it was not because the system was broken. It's because it's a little dog. It's a pet, and it's a puppy, and it doesn't really understand, and it's learning, right? And I think that that's one way of doing it, but it only gets so far because we get stuck in tropes like, like the cute robots, this thing that the Japanese do so much, so that robots are not so intimidating because they're like little kids and you can deal with them. And instead of the, what is the Boston Dynamics, those dogs that jump around are very creepy, right? So it's like, but I think that we need to, the challenge right now would be moving from the kind of like the cuteness models or the it's a dream is random or fictions that kind of paper over those limitations, and how do we move to and I'm focusing on things like character, for example, like characters that can speak different dialects. Like one of the challenges as a writer when you're writing a character is making them have a distinctive voice, let alone having a distinctive voice that has to be generated. And that's something that we're still learning, but I think it's kind of like more trial and error, but always thinking about the relationship between the system and how it comes across.
Yeah, so I agree with Clara's answer there, and I would say that the stuff that we've been working on at Spirit with Character Engine is not about trying to get to these like fully realized, fully simulated characters at all. Like I said, it's about creating characters within a particular story space. And there's a couple of reasons for that, right? I mean, firstly, obviously, it's like really hard to to be like, yes, there's a fully autonomous character. You can say and do anything. But secondly, considering that what we're doing is building tools for game designers and narrative designers, like people want to be able to still tell very specific stories, right? People want to be able to tell very not allow the sort of possibilities to space to go off in like these completely these directions which they can't sort of which they can't manage. So so it is about sort of telling allowing designers to create these characters who just exist within that story space. And I think the analogy there, so I'm very late to the game. I only just started playing like Breath of the Wild like a couple of weeks ago. I think that the analogy there, and I will say, I'm really, really loving Breath of the Wild, and like there are so many moments where I was just like, oh my god, this is incredible! Like I can't believe you can actually do this. And it's just so sort of, it's just way more simulationist than I thought it would be, which was incredible. But even though it is that, I'm not like, okay, well now I just want to be able to, because I feel like I can kind of go anywhere and do anything within the constraints of this world. It doesn't make me want to be like, okay, now I want to like go to like get on a train or go to the beach or whatever, right? So, and I think that's kind of the analogy, but within the space of interact with characters, if that made any sense at all. But yeah, so
I have a question, which is there an Uncanny Valley problem in AI? Are there any examples? Because I'm wondering, I'm maybe a little skeptical that we applied the Uncanny Valley analogy a little too broadly, that maybe it's only for three-dimensional objects for human bodies. In fact, so I'm just wondering if people know, are there any examples that we can point to? And if not, and I don't think there is anyone like...
I would just say, like, I mean, like, people try to create, like, you know, like, chatbots that are believably human, and I think typically we're still so far on the other side of the valley. Like, we're not in the valley yet. We're still on the, like, it's obviously not human.
Right, so we all agree that there aren't any, and then this could be evidence that we haven't gone far enough, or it could be evidence that there isn't a problem, because there's no Uncanny Valley in drawing. Like, as your drawings get more realistic, they don't get creepy. Maybe it's just for... So anyway, I'm just wondering, maybe it doesn't exist. I think most of the problems with AI is just that it's not good. It's just like frustrating, or it's awkward, or it's it's bad in some way. Not that it's like so good it's creepy. Yeah.
I wanted to pick up a different point on the idea of narrative procedural character generation, which is that I think it's interesting that as game designers, when we're making procedural content, which we often do across every kind of game, especially in the kind of era of small teams and independent games, procedural content has become like a really huge thing. And when you're making a procedural level designer, there's two basic strategies, right? There's the creation strategy, the bottom-up strategy, where I try to create a algorithm that will generate an interesting level or an interesting world in some sort of way. And then there's this kind of search strategy, where instead I just generate as many random permutations of the dimensional space that I'm interested in as possible, and I rely on the fact that computers are fast, and I try to design a set of rules for recognizing good random outcomes. And I think one of the things that's interesting is we haven't really, as far as I can see, people don't really use the second approach for procedural narrative and character interactions in the same way. A little bit.
It depends on how.
We also have these two. Maybe on this side we should use this mic.
Yeah, it depends on how you design it, because, for example, the puzzle dice system was designed so you didn't have to get an AI solver. It was the items that would go. It was a grammar-based system, so that the items that would go there, we were sure they would work.
Right.
It's a cheaper way of doing it, but the way that you're suggesting is the better one.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that, I mean, I've seen people design puzzles in this sort of search-based way for games that involve pushing blocks and so on. The idea of a good puzzle is something that the designer has a strong sense of, but it's an intuitive sense. So they generate like 100,000 levels and they play them all and they try to figure out which of those ones is good. And it seems like this is a thing that could be further enhanced by a kind of computational learning strategy, right? Like, just, I'm going to give you a bunch of sets of good levels and you're going to develop some kind of vague model of what's good. And if that could work for puzzle levels, I don't see why it couldn't also work for narrative situations.
But isn't that the heart of like all this Monte Carlo tree search stuff? Isn't it that you have evaluative functions, but basically it's kind of a random search or a brute force search, and then you're constantly then applying this criteria, right? I don't really understand how that stuff works.
I think someone else is going to answer this in the audience, but I'll move this over here. Does anyone? I'm pretty sure someone. So maybe we start moving. I'll figure this out. We're going to work somehow.
So MCTS is usually used as an AI for a lot of things, right? So there has been lots of work on evaluating the game state in terms of how good you're doing as an AI. There's less work on metrics, how to define what a good game consists of. So the things you were talking about at the beginning, you said something like, we see if it is better, right? So what is better? And then you went ahead and said something about, I want the bullet to hit 75% of the time. And that actually raised a question I had. Are game designers able to define what they're looking for? Because now it sounds it's not really the case, so it might be just another learning problem about having a set of things that you like and then trying to figure out the features that describe these kind of things.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely one of the things that game designers spend most of their time doing is trying to figure out what's good, so that you can replicate it. You maybe made one good thing and you could recognize it as good, but you didn't recognize it using a system of rules or an algorithm or anything like that. You just recognized it, and it's something that I think I spend a lot of my time doing as a game designer.
It seems like we do it on multiple scales, right? Not only in a single game, but also as a designer, you're doing that in your career. But then if you look at the App Store, right, it really looks like we're making every game, and then some of them bubble to the top, right? Or if you look at Congregate, right, it's like, let's make every game and then see which ones are popular.
There's also, I think that one of the issues is how the tools work. So going back to your question, like, is this working? I think that what comes from this panel is that we use a hybrid approach. There's part of it where we're using AI as a tool to help us evaluate games. And we kind of need the human factor because it's a bit hard still to this day to teach a computer what's good game design. It's the same as with music, for example, right? You can have computers compose music in the style of Mozart, and it is in the style, but it's kind of lacking the human factor. Or in animation, when you have procedural animation combined with traditional animators, using it again as a tool. So I think that one of the issues to get a bit further would be making tools that are more accessible to designers, and also getting designers to understand AI a bit better. I think that's kind of like a meeting on both sides, because at times understanding how you can do all the things that AI would allow you to do is a matter of coding in a specific way, or like going through huge databases and having a way to access all that information would be one of the best steps to take. Like, not improving the technology itself, but the tools that we can use.
It's kind of funny, all the sort of different, just very quickly, it's kind of funny all the different points in culture when like empirical aesthetics becomes sort of fashionable again, or sort of like a necessary thing. Like the whole, like in the olden days when it was like, okay, what makes an objectively good painting, right? And that kind of definitely fell out of fashion for a while. And now, thanks to AI, we're like raising those questions again. So
it is. It's really interesting, and it really bears highlighting this point that the question of what is a good game, and I get into arguments with Julian about this all the time, right? This question of like evaluating the quality of a game, like that is what the project of game design is. It's not like that's part of game design, right? And we could use a tool that could help us. Like, that is game design, and in a sense, art is always involved in an arms race with our understanding of art, because part of the job of art is to remain outside of the scope of precise evaluation and definition.
Yeah, just one more thing to Clara's point, then I'll pass it up. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about the same thing that Clara mentioned, which is sort of, are there kind of intermediary tools to help game designers understand AI methods and procedural generation, and even like pathfinding utility functions, all these techniques. Like, I can imagine exactly what this tool looks like in my head. It's like, could be a 2D tool. I'm moving a lot of pieces around. I'm like, let me test this algorithm, or let me test this type of search, or let me test this type of pathfinding, and like have these kind of simulations play out right in front of me. And like, even my team, I could see us using that. Like, what if I instead wanted to use this type of positioning instead of like this type of utility-based grid? I wanted to use, just dynamic nav mesh. Like, I think that a lot of these things are such shared technology that I'm surprised there aren't more sort of like ad hoc middleware tools, almost just like to assist you in thinking about different types of AI solutions. And there has been like some really good talks, like I think I wrote down, I'm going to forget her name. There was a practical procedural content generation for everyone talk at GDC a few years ago by someone named Kate Compton. And that, like, as soon as I saw that, I like turned to my AI program and I was like, Helton sequence. That's the thing that I've been like trying to come up with to like help spread out all these random things we're doing so that they're not like so clustered. And like more kind of tools that allow the accessibility of that to game designers seems like a very tangible thing that the AI and computational research community could create as an output or collaborate with someone. And I think a lot of teams could theoretically build that tool themselves, but are they going to have the incentive and kind of resources to really do it well and make it universal?
Yep. What's the name of that sequence? Helton sequence.
Okay, thank you. Just I think a bit related to a couple of things you've been mentioning here. I want to tell you a short story about something that we did for our research, like 3 years ago with some Swedish guy who is sitting over here. We were 3-4 years ago brave and stupid enough to believe that we could do, very inspired by Cameron Brown's work on PCG to create board games, Javalath, whatever, I'm pretty sure you know him. We wanted to do kind of the same thing, but with card games. So we set up a whole thingy with PCG for creating card games from scratch using very simple actions, just a standard deck of cards, and let's create, let's code our PCG system to come up with the super interesting, super fun new games never seen before by the mankind. So good thing is that what we were using, because you mentioned uncanny things before, so I want to come up with a point at which we got stuck, okay, and why. We were using MCTS because since we were creating new games, nobody actually knew how to play those games, and we had to make the computer be ready to play unknown games, okay? So we use MCTS, which is pretty good, more or less, for that, okay? So, and with that thingy, we were able to evaluate if the games were playable or not. That's a good thing. With a very short-sighted MCTS faced against a super-sighted MCTS, we were able to automatically calculate if the games were fair, in the sense that a super intelligent agent could beat easily, almost every time, the not so intelligent agent. So you can measure that automatically. That's correct, okay? But the point at which, and we were producing some playable games, okay, which were complying to these, features. But the point is that the point at which we got stuck is a very important part, which is that we realized that yet the games were playable, okay, and fair, they weren't fun at all. And that's a point, okay? We got stuck at a point in which we tried to implement a function, an algorithm, whatever, that was able to identify what was fun from a human perspective, okay? So that's my little story. Maybe you can give me some advice or whatever.
I'm going to leave the answer to all these people, but I'm just going to say this falls 100% into the things that we've been discussing the whole time about the aesthetic judgment problem, right? The problem of like quantifying what makes up a good game, which happens to be the entire field of study of what Frank talked about, right? The entire project of game design. So yeah, trying to codify that is hard. I don't think we should stop trying, but it's extremely difficult.
But it's not like, I mean, you're not suggesting that fun is magic or something, that it couldn't be quantified, but if you worked hard enough, you just gave up. Yeah.
So I think this is a really great panel discussion, and I work in Monte Carlo research and AI-assisted game design, and actually one of the things that really strikes me is that it's an incredibly underexplored area. Like, it's just incredible. There's hardly anybody seriously working in this, and there's just so much to be done. And the other thing to keep in mind is that, as you say, I mean, all these things are, I don't think they're inherently unquantifiable. And of course, the notion of fun is incredibly subjective, but then you can build loads of different agents that sort of experience quantifiable fun in many, many different ways. I think it's a hugely interesting and important area of research. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the reason it doesn't work yet as well as it should do is that in many cases the AI is simply not smart enough. So the example you gave of the card games, MCTS works pretty well for many of those sort of games. There are many games that you can invent that the MCTS, without a good heuristic function, which it won't yet know for a novel game, it just doesn't work well enough. So you have these so-called smart agents play through the games, and they don't get to experience any fun because they're simply not smart enough. Could be. So you invent, you pick a sort of point in the game design space, and you give it to your agents to play, and they say, well, it's shit, actually. I'm not getting anything out of this. But the only reason that they're not experiencing how good the game is, that they're just not clever enough.
Yeah.
And so the other thing is about I really like your point about the Uncanny Valley, because I think it's more of a special case than a general case. And in many cases, as AI just gets smarter and smarter, the speech recognition on your phones, it works much, much better now than it did 5 years ago. And it never went through a point where you say, oh, it's getting a little bit creepy now. I don't think so anyway. You just appreciate that it works most of the time now. And yeah, but I think it's a hugely important area, and there's just so much more to be done.
Putting on my humanities helmet right now, whenever anybody talks about like quantifying fun or finding the formula of fun, and I've been to okay.
I wouldn't say we're looking for like a simple equation, but imagine you've got a population of really clever agents who have been, in some cases, trained on massive play logs of what humans experience and tend to enjoy, what sort of games humans find sticky and they keep coming back to. So don't think of it as a simple equation. Think of it as deep learning agents that play through these things, and you measure the experience of them.
Yeah, well, I have seen in computer science, in game design research conferences, formulas of fun more than once, and been horrified by it. But also, I think that one of the things that is challenging here in programming agents to play your games is that you have to account for different play styles, different knowledge, different preferences, and that's what is difficult to quantify. Like it's humanity. I mean, like I'm still a bit in the.
I'm usually on your side of this argument, but I'm willing to play devil's advocate here, because I do think that, I mean, you could say the same thing about all of the attempts to build flying machines until the Wright brothers got it, right? To me, I think this idea that what real AI is whatever hasn't been done yet. That's which I think is true, that there's this pattern of like, well, that's not, because you can quantify it. It's not, but I think that that's true. But I also think that that's valuable. I think it's good that we're constantly. There will always be a thing beyond what we are capable of breaking down and analyzing precisely or reproducing. And that's just the nature of wanting to continue to reach.
No, I don't think that we should give up. I don't think that it's something impossible, and I think it's something that is worth trying. But I think that maybe trying to account for the human messiness, the kind of varieties of, and maybe like saying like I'm going to build an AI of an expert player of blah, and know that that's who you're going to cater to, rather than I think that the thing that makes me uncomfortable is the overgeneralization of just one player.
I totally agree that all the existing versions of this suck, right? And not only from the AI community, but from game designers. Like game designers' attempts to like specify some kind of like hedonic formula. Oh, this is how. It's like it's all bullshit.
Well, hold up. I mean, I think that fun is obviously going to break down to be a very overloaded term. It's going to be a lot of different things. I think anybody who has ever designed a gambling machine can tell you that there are some dimensions of this that have been broken down into formulas, right? Where you can make a thing that a human being will sit and play for hours, if not weeks, just applying a formula. There's not. I mean, I don't think designers of slot machines really conceive of themselves as doing an intuitive, like artistic thing. No, there's science to that.
Right. Obviously, the problem with this when we get it wrong is the murky moral territory of like, if you don't fit within this thing, then you're like, your version of fun or whatever is like less valuable somehow, right? Or you are less valuable. So I think that's the thing that we keep bumping up against. Having said that, in my talk tomorrow, I'm going to put up some formulas for love. So
well, more than one. If there's more than one, okay.
And we can say objectively that Tetris is fun without making the larger claim that everyone likes Tetris, right? It's not, or that there's something wrong with you if you don't like Tetris, or that's the kind of terrain we want to be in.
All right, I'm gonna go back a little bit to the tools question and on a point that Clara made. I'm a tools engineer at a games company, so I tackle this problem a little bit, and I think part of the problem is one, the tools that have come out from academia and people have tried have not been good enough for what game tools usually are, or game editor tools usually are. So one is who's responsible to build those tools? Like, is academia or is the industry, and how are we gonna convince the other side to do it? And two, how do we get more people to talk across that bridge and make game designers know that these guys are doing crazy stuff that you could be using, and help game designers come to this community and ask for it? Like, who's to blame?
So yeah, this comes up a lot, especially because one of the AI programmers I work with was one of our tools programmers before, so we discussed this a lot. I mean, we really both feel that in order to get something like a good tool to implement the kinds of things that your community creates, we need like almost like an R&D-esque like AI researcher embedded in our company, specifically for like the lifetime of the project, right? So the projects we work on at Avalanche are usually like 2 to 3 years, maybe more. And we need someone whose sole job that is to work at the company, especially, and kind of, we have some R&D people, or we have people who work on these like long-term tools, but it's just like in the normal churn, like day to day of us working, like our tools programmers and our AI programmers do not have the bandwidth to spend so long implementing potentially experimental, unknown value, like AI research tools. As much as we think that they're fascinating and interesting, and we try and watch things like this, or read Game AI Pro books, or GDC AI summits, like those are the kind of things we're usually absorbing. Like, oh, that's cool. All right, back to using behavior trees for everything. Like, because implementing the thing that's I understand that it's understood that there are better options than behavior trees, but it's so impractical for my immediate team to implement that it's much more valuable for us to just say, well, how can we push behavior trees to do more, and how can we push the tools we already have to do more? I mean, we do use Havoc, Just Cause 3 uses Havoc, and so obviously improvements that come bubble up through things like that, we kind of absorb automatically over time. But yeah, I wish that there was more of a program, but both between companies and researchers and academics to embed themselves into some of these commercial projects that are bigger. There have been a few examples that I thought have been really cool. I think the Final Fantasy 15, the photo system, was done by a guy who was primarily an AI and emotions researcher who just had worked at the company for the lifetime of, for years on Final Fantasy 15, just working on the AI photo system. And then he gave a really cool GDC talk about that. Stuff like that, I wish that there was more of, and really look forward to hopefully happening.
Very quickly, I think that also, in the terms of research, I think that researchers have to say when something is done, because when you research something, it's continuously in development and it's never finished and it's never stable. And what we need for tools is something that is stable. And at times it's something that is hard to get across to research scientists. This is something that I'm struggling with myself right now. I'm working on a project or something else, and I'm asking my collaborators, can you give me the older version that is stable? And they're like, no, it's never going to be stable. It's like, can we make one that is stable instead of keeping the evolution? And I think that that's what gets in the way of incorporating these tools in actual game development. That there's the approach of I keep developing this because it's going to help me publish papers and come to conferences, but not in the release state. I'm going to package this. I'm going to document your code. Comment in your code. Things like those. This might seem silly, but that's a bit of what might be missing at times.
Yeah, so I'm going to go way back to sort of the initial opening. It's mostly sort of related to what Clara said about using the fictive papering over of gaps in AI. So some context, I made a game that had, or was part of making a game that had deep social simulation, and originally we were going to have one of the people will be played by a human, and it's we ran into the issue of we can't upload a simulated person's life into a person's brain, so we're just we're just gonna create some bullshit reason why that's not the case, and they're not in the simulation. So I just sort of putting the question out there, can you think of things gaps in games where you've been working where it's this is a really hard problem, and so I'll just paper over it with some bullshit answer, as sort of future work for AI that not the magic fun box that I stick a game in and it tells me you've created chess 2, this is amazing, but actual concrete problems of if I could have just gone 10% further in this, I wouldn't have had to cover over it. I'm just sort of putting that out there.
I try not to do that. But yeah, I think that one of the examples where that was the case, where like we were trying to paper things over and not very well, was Stranded in Singapore, because at times the puzzles were kind of funny, and like some of the combinations were like funny for us, but people didn't get the joke. We tried to increase the humor through the writing, but because it was a mixture, we were trying to get across the culture of Singapore. Some people thought that we were parodying Singapore. There were people who were very offended because they thought that we were making fun of Singapore. And it's like, no, this is Singaporean people writing the jokes. It's not. So it was a kind of like all the system itself. We could not paper over in the way that we did with when the premise was a dream logic, for example. But I try to make it work. That's the work of a game designer and narrative designer, kind of not making it that evident. But at times it also fails.
I think one of the ways that we paper over limitations of the human designer's brain is by cultivating aesthetic of elegance. I'm talking about more formal games now. So if you think about one of the most complicated balancing tuning problems is in making, for example, a collectible card game in Magic the Gathering or Netrunner or something like that. So we're going to have hundreds upon hundreds of cards, and we need to make sure that nothing is imbalanced in there, that they all belong in the deck. And you know, it becomes rapidly something that a human being is just not capable of as you add more and more cards. And in a certain way, this is like becomes a deeply enmeshed with what we consider to be good, whether we consider sort of elegant, small state spaces to be more interesting, or whether we consider large ones to be interesting. It's kind of an aesthetic battle that's raging on in games, video games, and in tabletop games. And you know, I think one of the things, maybe papering over is the wrong term here, but with the assistance of computational intelligence, you could make maximalist. You could move towards a maximalist aesthetic that's just impossible at the moment, right? You could have a collectible card game with 1 million cards. That would be aesthetically different. Who knows if it would be? I mean, I don't think it would be better or worse, but it would open up, huge dimensions of work that are currently just impossible.
I think of this as the Pokemon aesthetic. It's like a profusion of Baroque excess of, and then on the other end of the spectrum is Go, this very elegant game. If there was only a way to combine those things, obviously.
So going back to your question specifically about papering over with regard to social simulation. So actually, I think that when it comes to social simulation, we don't need to paper over so much, because I think there's almost like a one-to-one mapping between the ways that we can interact with people in games and in real life, right? So, for example, I worked on a game called Redshirt a few years ago, which is a simulated Facebook in space game, basically. And in that, the ways, basically the UI is one of like essentially a simulated Facebook. So the limitations that you're presented with are the same ones that you get when you're interacting with real people on social media, right? So that kind of worked as this kind of one-to-one mapping. And I think there are other games which kind of do that kind of thing as well. What I'm working on now is much more sort of conversational agents, right? And again, we have this one-to-one mapping with the kind of limitations we get with real people. Like, we don't, like, as much in the real world, we don't have this, like, full feed into each other's brains. All we can do is just talk to each other and find out about how one another works. And that's kind of how it works with interacting with simulated conversational agents as well, right? So yeah, I don't think we really need a papering over so much. It's really, the papering over comes in like what the simulated agent can talk about.
Just meeting a person for, like, if we had years of history in the game, and suddenly now you're like, oh, do you remember the time we went and did this? You're like, well, no, I don't. I'm not that person that you think that I am. Like,
that'd be cool. That'd be a great response. That'd be awesome.
Right, but
there's also then not putting in an AI or a character. It's a character in Absentia. It's like, okay, we don't have the technology to make a believable AI, so they're not there. I mean, that's all the shock games, so the system shock and all that, and Bioshock. But they're not there, so and the ones that are there are crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I think papering over like rings pretty true. I mean, I feel like in many ways, like all my AI are papering over. Like all of the implementation is papering over the fact that they're not real people, right? I mean, on a very low level, like I've said this already like 4 times, but because all the AI behavior trees are basically just if-else statements, a lot of what we do is like add hysteresis to everything. So it's not obvious that it's an if-else statement, right? Like when you move within 10 meters of the AI, he starts looking at you, but it's not until you move 15 meters away from them that they stop looking at you. Like that makes it slightly less obvious that it's not just a series of if-else statements, right? Like
That's good.
yeah.
That's good.
Yeah, so but like I mean, theoretically, what's the concrete answer of what it would take for me to not have to do that? It's probably just like, well, can I simulate sensory perception? Like, can I simulate like vision and hearing better on AI agents so that they like could actually perceive when you're like getting near them or a threat and stuff like that? But because I don't, I just like put hysteresis on like every possible set of values and makes a there's a lot more bordering to everything. And then the other thing is like Just Cause 3 is a sandbox game, and like one of the biggest themes of it is like chaos and unpredictability. And there's also narrative design that helps kind of paper over the AI in the sense that it's supposed to be a narrative of like this dictator kind of seizes control, and like they don't really know what they're doing with infrastructure, and like the army's really not well trained. So it's like okay if they do stupid things a lot of the times, or it's like okay if like cars randomly explode, because that kind of makes sense and is encouraged. And so there's always like a narrative. I think at least in Just Cause 3, there's a narrative design that kind of papers over everything. It's like it's allowed to be a little bit silly and chaotic and unpredictable and go wrong because that's sort of the fun. And then there's the low level papering over where we tried to implement behavior tree script and utility functions in such a way that makes it less obvious that they're using such simple tools.
Okay, so I've been just told that we're way over time. And this seems like to be good as any other point to thank our speakers, our panelists, and all the discussants for their contributions. Yeah, this is amazing. This could go on forever. So these, I don't know about Rob, but at least the other 4 have offices right over there.
Where's my office, Frank? Honorary office.
Yeah, Frank, where? So they'll be around, and maybe you will ask them to stay around for dinner tonight because they're more than welcome to join for the banquet at 6:30. We have a little short break now. There's coffee near the pantry, and the talks will begin here, I think right around here at 11 a.m. again. Thank you very much.